now back from the combine that you were at. I think you were there. What'd you say? You were there all week?
Yeah, all week.
Okay.
All week.
So, different or a new experience, I guess, for you being on this end. But we're going to be talking about quarterbacks a lot because that's still the primary focus for this team. But one thing I did want to start with, because you had an interview with Ron Rivera, a little sit down one-on-one, about 7 or 8 minutes. And one of the things you talked about was the skill position groups. And you asked them, basically, you told them you think that they should still be adding more. Convince me basically why I shouldn't feel that way, or am I right, or whatever. And I agree with you. I think there's too many ifs in that group to just, it's a little bit of a leap of faith to think that they'll all be answered affirmatively, or the questions would be all answered in the positive for them. So I would agree with you. What's your takeaway from what he said? And do you think that that's a position they would address, whether in free agency or maybe more so in the draft?
Yeah, so I got the vibe that, if someone that they really fell in love with was available at a spot they deemed kind of too good to pass up, they would take the shot. I think I came out of the conversation with Ron thinking that they're very high on Diami at the moment. They really like what he showed late in the year, and I think that's legitimate. But I would argue that did Diami show that he could be a true number 2 or even a number 3 consistently? And he showed flashes, but again, like if I'm trying to cultivate an NFL offense, I want a consistent player there. Obviously, he talked about Curtis Samuels and what they think he can do, and I think everyone is in agreement that he can be an electric player when he's healthy. But unfortunately, he wasn't healthy for an entire year, and obviously, you're banking on something that is, a year to 18 months old at this point in terms of his production at Carolina. And I know you paid him a fair amount of money, but especially in this year's draft, like there's obviously the top 5 receivers that you feel really good about, but then I think there's another 5, maybe 8 guys that change your receiver room, and you can get them in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th round and feel really good about it. Like a guy that comes to mind is the kid from Cincinnati, Alec Pierce. Like no one's really talking about him, and he's going to be like a legit number 2 in this offense. Like he could be that kind of skill set. He adds a little bit of competition. He adds an element of physicality. He just makes the room better. And I think that should be the goal. Like, we've talked about this before, but you want to, at the end of the day, be in a position where you have to cut good football players because you've increased your roster so much. And I think that should be the goal with that room, especially given kind of the unproven commodities. But I got the vibe from Ron that they feel really good about it. And unless something glaring happened in the draft or in free agency, they probably wouldn't make a move there. And again, like I don't agree with that, but I also think it speaks to where Ron is at with the team. What I mean by that is coaches tend to be a little bit more optimistic when it comes to players. And, I think I've told you this before also, when I was a player, I always believed that the coach should have final say on personnel. And I remember having a conversation with Wes Phillips, who's now the OC for the Minnesota Vikings. And he was telling me, coaches are just too close to that decision. They see that they have a personal relationship with the player. They kind of see the glass half full type of thing. It's nice to have someone who doesn't know the player have input on the decision because they can be a little bit more objective. And so I think it's good that Martin Mayhew's involved in these decisions now because maybe they can kind of steer the ship in a way and kind of reach a compromise on this. But I think if it was up to Ron, I think he just kind of ride with what they have in the receiver room at the moment.
And you're right. He is definitely, he has admitted that he is a glass half full guy, very optimistic by nature. I think it's kind of, that's how he's been throughout his coaching career. So, but I'm with you. I think, and I would look for one more so in the draft because as you pointed out, it is a deep draft for receivers again. And I think for me, going against a free agent type there are a lot of financial decisions this team has to make. I'd rather, do you want to invest in Amari Cooper or would you rather invest in the extension for Terry plus some, keeping more of those defensive linemen around, et cetera?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I think this is why team building is so fun. I think obviously adding a piece like Amari Cooper and what he's done over the last, 5 years has been pretty outstanding. But the price point is the thing you're always negotiating. Like, what is the value? And I think if I'm Ron, if I'm the Commanders organization, I'm going to slow pay that. I'm always going to look to build through the draft just because financially there's an incentive there, right? I can bring in a receiver. I can bring in a game changer at that position. We mentioned Alex Pierce, but there's, a guy like Watson out of North Dakota State University, who's 6'4", he runs a 4.3. There's a guy out of Middle Tennessee State who was uncoverable at the Senior Bowl, small guy, but uncoverable. Like there's skill sets kind of throughout, and those guys will be there in the third round. So why not? Why not elevate your roster that way at a cheap price point? You don't have to break the bank on Amari Cooper, right? Especially if you're looking to make some splashes in terms of quarterback in the free agency market. Obviously, I don't think that's going to happen just based on the current climate. But yeah, I'm a big build through the draft unless the value is there for a receiver in free agency. And what I mean by that is, what is Mike Williams' value in free agency? Is he, maybe a $10 million a year type guy? And then that would be a tremendous value. And you could bring him here and he would elevate this roster.
Right. And yeah, absolutely. How key do you think getting a quarterback is in here right away to help build out that roster, whether through some minor free agent signings or anything?
Yeah, so I think I'm doing a quarterback evaluation Monday, Wednesday, Friday for 980 at the moment, and so I've watched all the kind of names in free agency, and a guy that really stuck out to me was Derek Carr, and Derek Carr was exceptional in Las Vegas, just in terms of his ability to distribute the football and make clean decisions. His footwork's awesome, his release is awesome, but the problem with him is he probably wants $40 million plus, and I think with a guy like him, you run into kind of the Kirk Cousins conundrum. And what I mean by that is you get a guy who's good, he makes your team better, you sign him to a big deal, and then all of a sudden the roster kind of degrades around him. So I think in terms of free agency, you got to kind of have that in mind. I asked Martin Mayhew about that when they signed Matt Stafford to Detroit, and whether that inhibited their ability to grow the roster around him. And he kind of played it tongue in cheek, but I got the impression that it did. And so I think that's in his mind, and I think that's something that always needs to be considered. So in the context of the Commanders, I would say, and I've told you this before, go out and sign a Jameis Winston.
Right.
Trust your coaching staff. Yeah, trust your coaching staff to kind of guide him, put those rails on him like they had in New Orleans last year. Because when you watch him play, he does some spectacular stuff with his eyes. He's got elite anticipation. He understands coverages. He elevates a group of playmakers. If you look at that group of playmakers in New Orleans, it was not very good outside of Alvin Kamara, but he was able to throw those guys open, use his eye discipline to manipulate underneath coverage and make easy completions. He is a special player, minus the fact that he might screw around and throw 30 interceptions in a season. Get a guy like that. And then I would say draft a guy. And we've talked about this before, because young quarterbacks are so cheap. Now, let's say you miss this year. Go ahead and draft another one in 2023.
Right.
Just keep going with it, making that decision over and over again and building. And I know that's not necessarily the most exciting things for a fan to hear, but that's how you find somebody, is you keep taking shots at it. And I think when you kind of go for that big free agent signing, you limit your ability to take shots, and that's never good.
And sticking with that theme of, like Jameis Winston, and I know last year he was free, they really didn't call him. And I'm not confident that they're going to call him this time either. And it sounds like he would go back to the Saints as well. Mm-hmm. But to that point, how much better of an option do you think he is than a Trubisky, Mariota, Bridgewater?
Right. So to me, okay, so I think there's two things to talk about here. One, I think because they saw him in Carolina, Carolina plays in the same division as Tampa Bay, and they got to see kind of the really downside of Jameis. They get to see kind of the plane crash that he can be at times. Right. But if you watch his film from last year, he, in my estimation, is considerably better than any of the other quarterbacks you just mentioned. I just watched Mitch Trubisky last night, watched 3 games from 2019 when he was the last time he started for the Bears before he got benched for Nick Foles. And you just see a guy who has a hard time processing at a high level. When it's an easy throw, off of play action or RPO, you see a quick release, you see a strong arm, you see a guy who has NFL starting quarterback traits. But in terms of processing what the offense is trying to do and how the defense is trying to stop them, he seems to struggle in that area pretty significantly. And so if I had a pick, I would say I'd rather the guy in Jameis Winston who has the ability to elevate a group, if that makes sense. In the same way, he's not Derek Carr, because Derek Carr is much more fastidious with the football and is just much more efficient generally. But I think he kind of has some of those same traits that make you really, really excited. I think he has a tendency, Jameis Winston, to play too much hero ball. But if you can limit that a little bit, I think you get a starting caliber NFL quarterback. The problem with Mitch Trubisky, the problem with Mariota, the problem with some of those other guys you mentioned on that list is I don't think you get a starter in the NFL. I think you get a guy who's kind of a top end backup at the moment. Now, Mitch Trubisky might have done some growing and evolved. I remember talking to Rex Grossman about how him sitting for a little bit gave him a new perspective, helped him become a better student of the game and helped him be a better pro later in his career, he felt. And that could have happened for Mitch this year. You're sitting in an offense that's very quarterback friendly behind one of the best in the game. Maybe you do a lot of growing in that type of time frame. But just based on the film that he has shown the NFL, I don't see a guy that's going to make this bunch of playmakers better. I see a guy you have to kind of insulate in terms of play calling. And I see the same thing with Marcus Mariota, to be quite frank, a guy who's doesn't have the strongest arm, kind of inaccurate, kind of like a slightly better version of Taylor Heineke. And so in this situation, if you're going to go in one of those guys' direction, obviously Mitch Trubisky physically is better, but you have a guy in Heineke who's been in the offense for a year, who knows it, and maybe that can be your bridge guy. You definitely need to do something at quarterback. I just don't think those two guys give you the upgrade that I think a lot of fans think that they do.
Yeah, and I think people will probably be very split on them. I think with Trubisky, and I wanted to ask you this too, because what you'll hear is, one, Matt Nagy, his offense didn't suit him well, and that he did and here's what you hear, like, one, they need to run more play action for him. Two, the concepts, the what you'll hear from, for people who prefer him, that the concepts in Chicago made him kind of play more robotic, and that he didn't have the freedom to move off certain things based on a look. Whereas in Buffalo, what you'll hear is that in that offense, there's a little bit more freedom for the quarterback to get off a look and get to something you're more comfortable with right away. So, however, whether or not that's going to result in better play, it's what is going to be said to say this is why Team X wanted him.
Right. And I think he at times shows flashes, but if you're talking about running more play action, like the offense in Chicago was built off of play action. They were a run first, run second type of team. They got to play action when he needed it. He just, in terms of drop back passing game, again, like I grew up kind of in the West Coast offense. I played in the NFL for 10 years. I've heard multiple installations of it. And to me, when I see some of the decisions he was making, I was like, I don't know how they're coaching it, but based on the offenses I've been in, like, the ball should be probably going here. And that's the only thing. I can just assume that it's approximately the same because the concept's approximately the same. And I just saw him holding the ball too long. I saw him waiting on guys coming open. I think when you watch Derek Carr, for example, he's a guy that understands versus cover 3 or Tampa 2. I don't care what the concept is necessarily, but the ball is going to be hit to the check down. And his ability to just make that decision, Tom Brady does it excellently, Drew Brees does it, Peyton Manning, when he was playing, did that at a very high level, is just understanding the coverage, and then based on that coverage, where the ball is most likely to go. And then when it's time to make a play, you got to make a play, and maybe you got to force the ball. But I just see him sitting on stuff, kind of double clutching. His feet are a little off, his rhythm's off in terms of his throw. And that, to me, those are not good signs, because he doesn't trust the concept to come open the way it's supposed to come open. And I was watching, I think it was the New York game. He threw an interception to a guy underneath, and you can tell the concept. It's a dig and a shallow cross underneath. And the shallow cross is supposed to pull the underneath coverage down to open up for the dig. And the dig opens up beautifully, and he throws it right to the defender who's jumping the shallow cross or the underneath route. And to me, that, again, I don't know what's happening in the install, but based on just good offensive principle, I would say the ball needs to go to the second level throw there. And he just didn't see it. He didn't anticipate it. He didn't understand what the defense was trying to do. And so those things, to me, obviously can be helped by coaching and offensive scheme. But quite frankly, here we run a lot of dig concept, deep daggers, deep variations of that concept. And so if you don't see that well, I don't know how you would expect him to see that well here, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of when I've watched him, I've seen and in fact, I have talked to people, whether it's close to him or who like him, and I've asked those same things, that you see a guy sometimes waiting to throw a guy, not throwing them open, but waiting till they're open to start then throwing. And what is that a sign of? Was that, some people would say, well, that concepts, or is it just like you said, it's just you're not processing it the right way or whatever. And then I also saw some games where the mechanics were just off with the feet, and that it was almost like, I always liken it to a shooter in basketball. You might be And for people listening, Larry Hughes back in the day was a really good offensive scorer, not a great shooter, but could have really good shooting games when things were just clicking for him, but the mechanics made it inconsistent.
Yeah, and I think I think that's one of the things you see is obviously I mentioned his quick release, I mentioned his live arm, but in the Atlanta, yeah, he's a good athlete. In the Atlanta game, for example, they had schemed open a couple opportunities down the field, and he's got a big arm, but he missed three of them, like not in succession, but on repeating drives. Right, the following drive, it's a big play, probably should be a touchdown. If not, it's a big chunk play kind of thing. Overthrow. He threw a fade to the outside. He's not throwing it like where it's missing in bounds. He's throwing it into the white of the sideline, which is a bad miss. And he did that 2 times in a row. Again, there's just a lot of inconsistencies there. I agree. I think his footwork can be better, and he also just his pocket presence. He's a little scatterbrained in there. He's leaning into pressure. Like they run a play action where the offensive line's going right. They have the tight end coming back, blocking left. And instead of kind of working to the right where there's this nice pocket, he works straight back on his drop and really stresses the tight end's block. And you're kind of like, just if you just kind of work a couple degrees the other way, you have a nice fleshed out pocket. And that could be coaching. I'm not saying that that's on him.
Right.
Like that could be how they're coaching it. But I do think that there are, like, when you watch the film, and even you mentioned kind of like their quick game, and like working a side of the field versus a certain coverage. You see him screwing that up, at least the way I've been taught it, a fair amount of times. And so you're kind of like, is he not seeing this? I know they're disguising the coverage, but good quarterbacks through film study and preparation, they develop tells and understand that this is how they run their cover 3. This is how they run their fire zone. And when they run their fire zone, I prefer to work this side of the field. And so those types of things are inexperience based. And I think they can be helped through game study, and they would be helped by this kind of year to himself. But again, I think there's a lot of things about his game that make you a little nervous, and I don't see it as a huge upgrade over the current situation. Obviously, from a physical standpoint, like you mentioned, athletically, arm strength, release, yes. But quarterback is more complicated than that. And
it's always
yeah, and like talking about the combine and seeing all these measurables from the quarterback, it's more complicated than that as well. So I think it's important to keep that in mind when talking about these players.
Right. And to me, if they went out and got a guy like that, then I'm still drafting a guy.
Yep.
And then I'm also going, like, I'm not sitting here thinking, okay, problem solved. I'm thinking, if I'm them, hey, maybe one of these guys hits. And if not, we're back and we're going to be as aggressive next year as we tried to be this year.
Yeah, I think that's the right way to go about it. I mean, and I don't know, coming out of the combine, I think it was actually a pretty positive experience for, I think, most of the quarterbacks there. Obviously, Kenny Pickett's hand was small, but he threw the ball really well in workouts. His college tape is very, very good. It's not, I don't want to say it's exceptional, but in terms of like the processing elements of running a pro style offense, it's all there. He makes tight window throws. He doesn't do great against pressure, all those things, but looked good. I think answered a lot of questions. Then Malik Willis, from what I understand, did a great job in the interview process. And I think the thing you feel good about if you're this coaching staff is that his ceiling is astronomically high. Obviously his floor is not, he's out of the league in 2 years kind of thing. But I think when coming out of this, he interviewed really well. He answered a lot of football type questions really well. And so I think you feel better about those two guys when you're picking at 11, assuming that they're there. You know what I mean? And that's a big assumption. Obviously Carolina, might be in the market for a quarterback, but I saw a mock draft recently that said, Malik Willis to the Commanders. And I think that actually is a pretty good fit, especially if you get a guy like Trubisky to kind of helm the ship for a little bit and let Malik grow in the background.
I think the feeling is in talking to multiple people about him, because he's a guy that you have to do a lot of homework on, because as far as like a reporter, they could still take him. And I think the scenario is with a veteran quarterback. And so because the feeling is by, again, multiple people, it's going to take him a while. And that's why you have to have him with the veteran. It always takes rookies. There's always a transition period for every rookie quarterback, every rookie. But for him, it sounds like it's going to be a lot longer. And,
Yeah, I think that's what I thought going into this week. And the scuttlebutt coming out of the Senior Bowl was that he was having a hard time learning the offense. I guess one of his coaches spun up a rumor that he couldn't learn, kind of period. And I think that was a big concern for a lot of coaching staffs. And I think in his interview process, I heard from multiple teams, not anybody with the Commanders specifically, but multiple teams, that he impressed them in interviews. Now, it's important to keep in mind that they're really coached up in these interviews. They go to these coaches that prep them for, the good plays, the bad plays, and everything in between. But they said they were impressed with his attention to detail, his demeanor in the room. And, he did well in the Wonderlic. Again, that test is circulating now in the ether, so you can get old Wonderlics and get the guys to take them. But all those things kind of indicate that maybe he's a better student of the game than people were led to think.
Yeah.
And I think that that's important to consider. Again, there's always issues with kind of saying, oh, he did well in this one interview, let's ignore all this other information. But it is another data point that kind of shapes your perspective.
And the thing I always heard with him too was, first of all, playing at Liberty, you're playing against lesser competition. Now you're also playing with that, but you're playing, so there's the adjustment there, and then there's the adjustment in the huddle and calling plays and doing all that. Yeah. So there's a wide range of adjustments that every quarterback has to go through, but I think there's probably more of them because of the level of play. And then, and so we'll see. But I think that's where the scenario is for him. If you get that veteran guy, that's where then there's some like, okay, maybe that's when you take him, because if he hits, it could be really good for you. And if he doesn't, then, try again next year. So. Yeah,
absolutely. I think that's the exciting thing about him, Mike. And I was thinking about this before we got on the call, but there is this kind of confirmation bias with players that gets you more excited. You hear them, oh, he's better in the interview than I thought. Oh, he's better on the one. And one of the reasons you feel that way about him is because he's dynamic, man. He is special. His arm, like watching him throw the football in person, you're just like, wow. That is a special trait. Watching him run on film, you're like, not many people in the world can do what he's doing. So you kind of talk yourself into guys. It's the same thing with like Jordan Davis. Everyone's talking about his 40 and all the measurables that he had during the combine. And you're like, oh, well, maybe you can extrapolate to a better pass rusher. The problem is when you turn on the tape, there's all these issues that kind of tell you that that's not who he is, right? Despite this tremendous testing. So you always kind of got to walk that line, because like with Malik, you see all this upside, value. But can he get there is the question. And that's the $1 million question. You mentioned some of the hurdles. And then that's why a guy like Kenny Pickett, I think, is a little bit safer, because you watch the film, it's not the best film of all time, but it's at least consistent. And he's doing NFL things. He's saying plays in the huddle. And you say the leap to get from point A to point B is not quite as extreme with a guy like him.
And there's more games, again, higher level of competition. I think that matters here. So but that's part of the intrigue with Malik, because, when you get him a certain level of coaching, when he's, getting different concepts, I think there's like, where does he go? So there's intrigue. The other guy that to me is kind of a mix of those two is Desmond Ridder. And because like he's got the experience, he played at a higher level. That guy is athletic as heck too. Yeah. And so I'm curious what you think of him.
Yeah. So Desmond Ridder is a guy that you want to like. You go, I went to his presser, you get to hear him talk. He's got this deep voice. He's got this maturity about him. People ask him about his inaccuracy when he plays. He says, oh, that I'm seeing a specialist. That happens when I overstride. Obviously, he was coached up on that answer, but he's just got the answers. It's like a business interview. It's like a debrief. He just knows what to say and what to do. I've heard from teams that interviewed him that he just kind of had this presence in the room that made you want to listen. And you could see it. You could see it at his presser, right? Same type of thing. Obviously, the physical measurables are outstanding. Like 40, 5'10", 5, broad jump, vertical jump, a tremendous athlete, obviously. But then you got to turn on the tape. And that's the thing I think that is the biggest hiccup for him, because you see elite level arm strength. You see a nice release. It's a little awkward, a little low. Gets a lot of balls batted down, especially in the Alabama game. But I think the thing with him is that he does have this inconsistent accuracy issue.
He does.
And this poor decision-making element. And he would like you to think that he can get out of that. And after hearing him talk, you're like, well, maybe he can fix it. But, I had a conversation with a passing game coordinator, and he said, the problem with a guy like him is he is perfect. He's got perfect mechanics. And so when he misses throws, you know that it's something outside of the mechanics, you know that it's probably not correctable. So that set off huge warning signs in my head, because it's like, that's exactly what he is. He doesn't have, when you watch even a guy like Mitch Trubisky, his footwork gets all wonky, his platform gets weird. Malik Willis, same thing, weird platform. That's not how he is. That's his platform's usually pretty good. Now, he'd have you think that it is related to overstriding or whatever, and maybe it is. I'm not a quarterback expert. But again, when you watch his film, there's enough question marks. That's why the combine is so tricky. A lot of people say, oh, coming out of the combine, this guy's number one. But you have to marry that with what you see from the other, the 500 hours of tape that you have on the guy, the 500 hours of interviews you've done. And I know that he's impressive, and I know that physically, from a leadership standpoint, he's impressive, but the film to me is the biggest question mark. And I hope it is something he can get corrected. But I also think he was thrown Alec Pierce, who's probably going to be a second or third round pick. The tight end there was going to be the number one tight end coming out this year. And he obviously got hurt, didn't come out, but he had weapons there that he was throwing to. And to see that kind of middling production in an offense that kind of guards a lot of his decisions, a lot of RPO, a lot of kind of zone read to quick dump flat type throws. That is also a significant factor. So in terms of big time NFL throws that he's making in each game, how many of them is he accurate on? How many of them are complete? And that percentage, at least to my observation, drops way, way down, and is a reason that I think people aren't talking about him with those other two guys.
It's funny with him because, and this is how, like, you can appreciate this. So I was watching him this morning. So I watched a couple games, watched the Alabama game, and I wanted to see, like, why is he high on this throw? So I take a snapshot of when he's getting his release, just to see, like, the base and the overstriding and all that. And I'm looking at, like, well, it kind of looks the same when he's doing this, right? I mean, but the one thing I wonder is, because he does have a longer stride and he does have a windup, and if that doesn't disrupt some of the timing of when you're coming through with the ball. And again, this is getting a little bit geeky, but I know Jordan Palmer is the guy that he works with, and he's talked about that. I've seen him talk about that, about Desmond. And someday I hope to talk to Jordan about that if he's in play. But just like, does the long delivery combined with the stride lead to a little hiccup sometimes in the timing of everything? And if not, then, like, I'm like you, like, why was he high on this throw? Because it looks like everything lines up right.
Yeah, and I think that's, to me, the $1 million question. Because when I'm watching it to my eye, it doesn't look like it. Now, I'm not, like, Jordan Palmer is a quarterback expert, right? So I would defer to him. Now, he is, Jordan and Ritter have like kind of a relationship that would be financially advantageous if Ritter were to go in the first round. So he's going to say and kind of coach in a way that lends itself to that relationship. But I do think that's something that every NFL organization is thinking about. Like, when I talked to this passing game coordinator and that came up, like, you could tell it was something that was weighing heavily on him, because they like him in the meeting. You like him. Everything, you physically, emotionally, he's mature. He's got a kid. He's married. All those things. Check. A total contrast to a guy like Malik Willis, who's a little bit more casual, a little bit more laid back, right? You can tell this guy is a professional football player already, and you want to like that. You want to invest in that. But when the tape doesn't support it, you got to have that doubt in your mind and say, how long, how developmental is this? And can he get to where he goes? Now, he might go to his pro day and just crush it. And everyone says, oh, well, obviously that was a mistake. But I think that would be a mistake also. I think that film is so important to make sure you evaluate, because again, that's what you have the most data points on, is that film.
Right. And it's funny, because with him too, I heard the same thing that you did about the interviews, and that he was really good at breaking down his plays. If they put a play up on tape, he was very good at methodical about breaking it down, which is always a good sign. Is there a quarterback that you like that we haven't talked about, like, for the draft, that's like, well, if they can get this guy in this, let's say they get a guy, like, let's say they get a free agent, and they go someone, they take a different spot at 11, and they want to get a quarterback second or third round. Who's your guy in that area?
I think, that's a good question. I think the guy that kind of stood out to me based on the bowl game appearances was the kid from Notre Dame. I think he just had, of all the quarterbacks involved in a Senior Bowl, so I think it was the Shrine game where he was at. I forget his name, but he looked kind of the most ready. His interview was really good at the combine. But again, I think I worry about his overall talent and whether it translates. So I think people, are talking about Matt Corral. Matt Corral makes me tremendously nervous because they run so much RPO in that system. He's not making full field reads all the time. And when he does make full field reads, it looks a little bit clunky and bulky and awkward for him. He's got a great release. He's got a good arm strength. He's a good athlete. But again, like the ability to process is not there. And I think that's one of the reasons why all these guys have a lot of question marks around them, is just you worry about some of these football elements, right? Because from what I understand, I was impressed with him in his interview. Sam Howell is another guy that people talk about all the time. And, they talk about him losing all this offensive production, but I think, he gets a lot of comparisons to Baker Mayfield. It's because they look physically similar on film, but also, so I think that kind of hurts him because of Baker Mayfield's trajectory in the NFL. Also, I think that Mitch Trubisky's kind of floundering shows what a quarterback transitioning from that offense to the NFL would go through. So all those guys, man, I don't know if I feel great about any single one of them. I think from a leadership standpoint, Sam Howell seems to be, from what I've heard coming out of the Senior Bowl, from what I've heard from his college coaches, seems to be the right guy from a leadership standpoint. Again, very deliberate arm mechanic in terms of throwing the football, kind of all over the place, plays a little bit of hero ball at times. Again, that's probably a result of all of his receivers getting drafted last year, all of his running backs getting drafted last year. But again, I don't love any of them. Outside of those top two guys, I wouldn't stand on the table for any single one of them. And obviously, if one's in the third round, Carroll or Howell, they won't be. But if they were, that maybe would be a good opportunity to take a value pick there. But there's reasons
I don't think they'd be there. I think it was Jack Cohn that you're trying to think of from Notre Dame.
Yeah. Thank you.
There you go. So, and then last thing, and I always appreciate your time. What's the one spot that you like that we haven't talked about? You say, I hope they address this, whether free agency, draft, whatever.
Yeah, I think everyone talks about linebacker quite a bit, and I'm not totally sold on the need to address that right now. And the reason I say that is because I do think there is some growing that's going to happen with all those young guys, Holcomb and Jamin. And I think if they get a veteran guy in here to play a little bit more and give him a mentorship role, I think that would be outstanding. I think the other thing that's great to know is there's a very deep linebacker draft this year.
Right.
The kid Muma out of Wyoming,
Chad Muma,
gets, I haven't really watched a ton of them, but everyone I talked to was like, oh, he's the next Sean Lee. He looks like Sean Lee. He plays like Sean Lee. And when you make that type of comparison, especially given the recent history of Wyoming linebackers, you say to yourself, this guy's going to be tremendous value. And the crazy thing is he might be there in the second or third round, which is great value, and it would elevate the linebacker room. So I don't think you need to go out and say we need to target Nakobe Dean or Lloyd from Utah to make this group better, because this is a deep draft class at the position. I mean, another guy that really stands out, just because we're talking draft, is the kid from Montana State. His name is Troy Anderson. At the Senior Bowl, everybody was there to watch Muma, but they came out talking about Anderson. He runs, he's physical, he understands how to fit on run plays in a nice way. He can coverage, he can cover. I mean, he played quarterback at Montana State. He played tight end, he played receiver, he played running back. The guy is just a really big, freaky athlete. I got a kind of funny story. So when I was in the they have like a medical hallway. I was just standing out in front, waiting for an interview, and this guy walked by, and it was Troy Anderson. And I was like, he was so big and so physical that I thought, I thought D linemen were going tomorrow, and then I looked him up, and obviously it's Troy Anderson, but that's the kind of physical freak that he is. And he might be around in the third round. So again, there's opportunities to fill that. I think a spot that I would look at, just because of the way this draft is composed at the moment, is edge rusher. They have some really dynamic, twitched up guys that would be a nice rotational piece at edge rusher. Like, you can get a guy all the way into the fourth round who shows tremendous twitch, tremendous athleticism. And the reason I say that, people are like, oh, look at all this draft capital we've invested along the defensive line. And I would agree with you. But if you look at elite defensive lines, they have almost like a hockey style rotation, right? They have 4 guys that come in, spell the first 4 guys, come back out. And having some depth there, I think, just makes Chase and Montez more effective in pass rushing situations if they need to be. And just having another person who can rush the passer is never a bad thing. And especially with this draft being so dense in that category, I think that's always important to consider.
Well, listen, I think 2 things you can never have enough of on defense is edge rushers and cornerbacks. And
yes,
I would always, if you have a chance to add somebody there, it could be really good, because I think, as we saw last year, you can't count on those 2 guys to do everything or to be there all year. You don't know. And when you look at the finances of it, are they going to have to make a decision with these two guys, with Sweat and Young, in coming years? So if you can get someone else in there, I think you want to always build depth there. So even if it's beyond, there are a couple guys even beyond the fourth round that could be interesting at that spot.
Yep.
At
Yep.
11, what about corner?
Yeah, I mean, there's some really good corners. I mean, I think that's the corner, to me personally, is the hardest position to evaluate. It's corners and safeties, because they're not around the ball that much. So to get a good evaluation on a corner, like all linemen, you might be able to watch 2 games. And with a corner, it's like 8 games, because you have to watch all the targets they get in those 8 games. And they're not involved in the down-to-down football the same way. But I do think it's a very dense cornerback class. Like I look at the way those corners ran, that the big kid who ran the 4.28 from the small school, like he'll be around in the second round, and you can make a pick there. So I don't think you need to reach for corner in the first round. I think if anything, at 11, it's, to me, from my perspective as of today, which is still pretty early in the offseason, it's quarterback, linebacker, and maybe offensive lineman, maybe like guard. There's some really good guards. The kid from A&M is really good. And so that would be something to look at there. But again, the crazy thing is, even offensive lineman sounds like a crazy thing to say, because it's so deep. There's a guy, from North Dakota who's 6'8", 315 pounds, who ran a sub 540. He's got 36-inch arms and tested and won almost every movement drill on the field. And he's going to be around in the 3rd round, and he can play in the NFL. Like, think about that. You're getting an NFL starter in the 3rd round. Like, this draft is so funny, because the top end is just okay. Like if it was my perfect situation and they didn't need a quarterback, I would trade out of 11 and just pick up that stuff in the middle, because this draft between 2 and 6 is unlike any draft I've ever seen before. There's just ball player after ball player after ball player. So that's where you're going to get the meat of this, right? So that's why I keep saying, trade out of that 1st round pick, get some stuff there in the second half of that draft, and you're going to be a happy camper, I think.
It's funny, Logan, that you say that, because last year my thought was, because of all the guys, there were going to be a lot of guys who would be 6th-year players in college, or they all came back as the COVID year, that I would have tried to get more capital in this draft, because you knew the depth would be there. And if it could have been used to move up for a quarterback, or just to have more picks in a deeper draft in those rounds. So I'm with you. Like, if they get a guy via trade, whether it's, Carr or whomever, then I would say, okay, then if Malik Willis is sitting there and you already got your guy, try to trade back, even if it's for an extra second, and you get another second. I think in this draft that would be valuable. So very last thing, I apologize. DeShaun Watson, would you do it?
Oh my gosh. I think we've talked about this before. So it's important to separate DeShaun Watson, the football player, from DeShaun Watson, and his legal stuff at the moment. I think that's critical, because they're different things at the time. So I'm going to speak to what I know about DeShaun Watson as a football player. Obviously, I played in Houston for half of a season, and I cannot say enough positive things about DeShaun Watson during my time in that nine-week period. He's a great leader. Guys respect him. He studies hard. He's charismatic. He's confident while not being, crass or overbearing about it. Physically, he's got all the tools. That offense down there is very hard to learn. He did an outstanding job. I hate trading 1st-round draft capital. I hate it, but I would consider giving up what they're asking for him, because of his ability and because of what he does. That's how highly I think of him as a football player. Obviously, the legal issues have not resolved themselves. And I think that adds an element of risk that I'm not quite ready for, because it's already a risk gathering thing. You basically are saying, we're not going to have a 1st-round pick. We're not going to have a blue chipper for 3 years for him. And I think that's probably warranted because of his age, because of his ability. But again, the legal stuff associated with that is not appropriate for me. And I wouldn't do it because of that. That would need to be resolved for me to do that.
Logan, you're the best, and I've kept you way too long, and I apologize, but I always appreciate your insight. And I know people do listening. I could go on forever with you, but I think you don't have that kind of time. So thank you very much. Oh, and by the way, tell people where they can, I've already said it before they got on here, but if they're just listening to this, where can they find you on Instagram?
Yeah, Logan_Paulsen 82, a lot of Instagram stuff there. And then obviously I do some stuff with the Commanders media and have some nice stuff there too. So make sure you check that out.
There you go. Thanks, Logan.
Appreciate it, John. Thank you.